Wynn and I flipped a coin at 7:30 this morning about who was going to teach this class, and he had an emergency, so it's by default mine. So questions will really be helpful and useful for me today. And so we're dealing with the Syrophoenician woman, which text has enormous problems for most people who hear it. This is the text. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. This is in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus doesn't want anybody to know anything about what he does or who he is. And now we have a religion built around him, and the Markan version of the faith actually died somewhere in the 60s. And yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first." And he wasn't talking about her daughter. That's a reference to the tribe of Israel. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." That's the hard saying that I flipped a coin about at 7:30 this morning. Yeah. But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Really very confrontive given the circumstances, and very clear. I might get a crumb. It might do me some good. You might change your mind. Then he said to her, for saying that, not because of any other reason, and I'll get to why he doesn't use any other reason, because Matthew doesn't want him to have any other reason. For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. This is how Jesus works, and he does a lot of long-distance healing. So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Now, what's offensive, and what really is offensive, is Jesus' attitude in this. He has to be converted, as he has to in all three of the synoptic gospels, into finding out what his real purpose in life is, and it changes, particularly in the Gospel of Matthew 3 times, and I'll get to that down the road. But the problem with this text is that it's embedded in a particular time in history which is true to Jesus' time, and the world has changed. If you don't get anything else out of this lecture, you get to hear a soliloquy that Kate Blanchett does at the beginning of Lord of the Rings. So you at least will get something out of this before you hear me talk. So this is Kate Blanchett, and it's just the best soliloquy in modern theatrical history. It is an amazing way she uses her voice. And if you've seen the Lord of the Rings trilogy, whenever she comes on, there's just no, wow, okay. And also, I told my wife that if Kate Blanchett should show up at my door, I'll be gone. And she gave me a list that was longer than that. So anyway, we have this agreement. I'm not going after Kate Blanchett, but she's amazing. So, and you can tell that I really think she's a great actress, which she is. And this is the soliloquy. I hope it's loud enough. I really wanted just the voice, because that's the deal, but I think we're going to get film with it. And you'll get to look at titles if you're looking at the screen. First one.
The world is changed. I feel it in the water. I feel it in the earth. I smell it in the air. Much that once was is lost, for none now live who remember it. It began with the forging.
We won't go into the forging of the ring. That we'll stay and watch the whole movie, and that may be better than this lecture. But we'll just hang in there and see what we can do with this. The world is changed. In those beautiful lines, I can see it, feel it in the air. I can see it in the earth. Now, that's my soliloquy. It's not nearly as good as hers. So just wanted you to get that voice, how she puts breath under all of those really important things about change. My point in starting is that Jesus lived in the same kind of time in the crossroads of a region that was embattled, both physically, and also lived in a region in which all sorts of people were coming out of the woodwork and being themselves. There are Syrians to the north that use the path down to Jerusalem as a way to get to trade in Egypt. And there are Egyptians using the same path up to get to Syria and over to Damascus. And of course, there's a road that way as well. So what's happening is that the world is changed. It is not pastoral the way we get it from most of the other Gospels, where Jesus is wandering around in nature and sitting by lakes and teaching people. He's in the middle of, as John the Baptist was, in the middle of a changing culture that could never find its own identity. And there was also, like our own day, no religious identity in the culture. We don't have it. You can go up the mountains in North Carolina and find 500 different kinds of churches in a 4 square mile area. The one-way apostolic holiness church of the divine God was one of them. So if we talk about identity as a church, we're very small. There are more Buddhists in the country than Episcopalians at this point. And half the churches in this country have under 50 parishioners every Sunday. That's the new statistic. We are fading, and we need to do something about it. But we need to realize that lots have changed since when I was born in the 1950s, and everybody went to church, and everybody liked church, and if they didn't like church, they didn't say much about it, right? At least not in my small social network. So earlier, if we were to wind the clock back from the point of this text, written down about 65, Jesus died in 27 AD. That's going to confuse you, but you'll have to live with it. We now know when he was born, which was 7 BC, and he lived 33 years. That puts him there. We just learned that fact about 10 years ago due to archaeology. So it's a mess, and the world changed because you have Romans, you have local traditions, you have Herod representing those, you have all sorts of diversity entering the culture, and people don't like it. And the church split into 2 pieces, and that happened before this gospel and the other gospels were written. There was a Jewish church, which doesn't leave much trace in Scripture, If you want the full dose of it, you get to the book of Revelation and you see how oppressed they were, because it's a visionary recital and you don't have visions about history unless you are in serious trouble as a group. There's been no prophet in Israel for 300 or 400 years. So it's a pretty barren landscape, and Jesus comes on the scene as a healer. That is, he practices Judean magic. And he also is on the scene as a teacher, and he teaches well. And then those two ministries in all three first Gospels disappear. And in Matthew, Jesus makes decisions about that. And finally, in Matthew 9, he decides, well, I just got to die. There's nothing else for me to do. I can't proclaim anything radical enough to say what I mean. So he starts predicting his death, and he starts predicting his resurrection, and he starts telling his disciples who do what we do, huh? You're going to get out of the grave? What? You're going to die. Really, seriously, why don't we go chill and go to Jerusalem, have a beer? So that's what they're doing. And so Jesus in the gospel narratives is very confrontive about what? He's confrontive about the complacency that things are going to stay the same. That things are going to be what they've always been expected to be. And they change. Things change. The world, and if Kate Blanchett says it, I believe it, that settles it. The world is changed. I can see it. This happened in reverse in the 3rd century. When Cyprian wrote, he said, I can tell that the world is wearing out. Jesus must be coming almost immediately, because you can see, you look at it, it's thin. The fabric of the world is thin. God is about to break through and fulfill his promise. And the world is tired and old and worn out. It's one of the best pieces in patristic literature. And we understand this passage as a positive thing because of what's happened in our culture over the last, I'm 60. So over the last 60 years, a lot has gone on. We are not who we were. The world has changed. And we are, as a church, mostly guilty of hiding from those changes as if they were going to change us, which of course they need to. And we're also hiding to make sure that the church is a safe place for people who don't like change, who resist it, who kind of say, well, give me that old-time religion. Let's go back to pre-evolutionary debates. Let's get back into those. Let's decide that we know that since we're Christians, we know the moral compass of God. And it always falls short, of course, of God's grace, but we don't worry about that right now in our Christian culture in America. We just want to make sure that everyone knows what God said that we should believe so that everything is settled. That is the goal of the church generally, is peace, contentment. This is not a text for people who like that model. So I'm just warning you that Jesus is not following either his own understanding, which this woman is confusing, and also she's pointing him in a new direction, and that's what we need to know. She immediately heard about him, Jesus, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Proskuneo, it means to bend the knee. It means to recognize that you're in the presence of something more important than you are. It means to give up what you know for what you do not know and hope that that exchange will help you. That's what faith is. It's not much else. Now, the woman was a Gentile. Jesus' ministry in the book of Mark is been to the Jewish people, only to the Jewish people. He's not been asked this question that we know of until this text. It's like believing when you get ordained as a priest that your ministry is primarily to Episcopalians. It's an offensive idea, actually. And on top of that, she was a Syrophoenician, which means that there's Syria, that great power, and then there's a long strip down to Phoenicia, where Samson came from, and down to the borders of Galilee, where Jesus came from, and it's somewhere in the midsection of that region that this meeting takes place, because in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' ministry is in Galilee. In the book of John, Jesus' ministry is in Jerusalem. That's why the Bible is literally true. Not. And all she wants is for him to do for her daughter what Jesus has been doing all over the place with everybody else who comes out of Jerusalem to see him and out of Galilee to see him. And the assumption is they're all of the same ethnicity and all of the same religion. And he's got it in his head the way I often did when I was a priest. Well, I don't really have time for those other people. And I'm not sure I like them, even though I went to a Methodist seminary. And so really, I've got enough on my hands here. And so every once in a while, someone would poke their head in my door who really I wasn't paid to do ministry for. That was offensive. How did God send me, the runaway kid, running away from somewhere into something very seriously disturbed, who knocks on my door and asks me if I have anything to eat? So I tried to, because he was clearly pre-psychotic, I tried to get him down to eat. He ate and ran out the back door because he knew I was calling somebody to come pick him up, which he really needed to happen. But that was my ministry and not his. My intention, not his. So one of the people I pray for every once in a while, when I think about him like right now, I pray that God will be with him and that he found what the prayer book says, a happy issue out of all his affliction. But he worried me, kept worrying me. And when I was sitting with him and talking and also trying to get the secretary to arrange to get him picked up, which he knew, it was uncomfortable. And he was eating crumbs out of a frozen Pepperidge Farm cake that was in the freezer, like this text. So where is God active? Most religious denominations would have you believe that we have a corner on God because we do it the right way. I mean, look at our liturgy. You can't beat it, and you can't. You can't. I went to Methodist seminary, and we had weekly chapel. And at weekly chapel, the candidates for ministry who are white would do a Methodist, normal Methodist, we'll make it up as we go along kind of service. And I went, and then the African American Methodists would come in and own the place and do something that was really extraordinary. It was just a very deep lesson to me, because I can't do what African Americans do in the pulpit because I wasn't born them. But I do know that when I was at chapel when the Methodist ministers were doing, and they were nice people. They were wonderful people. When I was among them, and I was listening to sermon, I was just mostly bored. You've never had that experience in church, I'm sure. So, what happens? Duke was at the time bringing seminarians in from all ethnicities. I had to deal with that, and I liked it, actually. but my parents didn't. New world. So Jesus is actually to be commended for actually stopping, because one of the things a Gentile Syrophoenician woman is potentially unclean. If she touches him, as is the custom, or he touches her, he has to ostracize himself from the religious community for at least a week, maybe a month. And I have stories about that, but I won't give them. That ostracism is something he could not afford. And he's always, also, as we know, hanging out with all the disreputable people in town. So what can you do? Let the children be fed first. We're the first. We're the Jewish people. We're here from the beginning. There's a tradition of Adam and Eve all the way up to us. We sit at the pinnacle of history. We sit at the pinnacle of religious evolution. We are the bomb. We're it. So Jesus should have, as a good Jewish man, like the prodigal son who's in the ditch, he should have just said, I'm going to walk by. But we don't have that as a characteristic of this man. Let the children be fed first, and it's translated for, but it ought to be translated and, it's the same thing. And it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. It's like me going into a Baptist church. Those dogs. We wouldn't get each other, and it would be an interesting thing to understand that maybe God's there and I'm not quite. That's Jesus' experience. If we look at the church's history, it's really about drawing a line around what we have and what you don't have. And that is emphasized by the Protestant notion of sin, because if you're sinning, you don't have God, and you should be ashamed of yourself and come to church. It's impossible not to be proud of where you live and serve and what you understand best. It's impossible not to be proud of it. But it's one thing to be proud of it, and another thing to insist on its goodness to the point that nobody can enter that is not permitted to enter. And of course, the religious life in this country, with its 5,000 religious denominations, has absolutely no idea and no hope at this point of reconciling itself with the rest of Christianity. We don't even have good conversations anymore. When I got ordained, we were having conversations with the Roman Catholics, with the Lutherans, with the Methodists. And I was on the ecumenical committee of the diocese, and it was really a nerve-wracking experience. Not only because we would have conversations and they'd talk about God in a way that was unfamiliar and clearly wrong, but then you'd have to go to their services, and you knew that really you wanted to get up. I was a young priest. You wanted to get up there and do it right, right? Hideous. So I've had these moments like Jesus where I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, I don't have the desire to stretch across a boundary and see what's on the other side. Harmon Smith, who my ethics teacher who did protest against racial segregation back in the 50s and 60s, he said it's really depressing to look across the line at a protest and realize that the people who are on the other side are as fervent, as committed, and as godly as you are. It's just depressing. You should get perks from being an Episcopalian, of course. And you do. You're here. But that's not the answer. It's like saying, why would we throw something precious to the dogs. These are not bull mastiff dogs. The Greek says they're like little lap dogs, which people had even in that day to keep the vermin off them and on the dog. And you held them in your lap as you ate. As you can see portraits of this in the 18th century, 17th, 18th century, of beautiful women all decked out, and they've got this little dog on their lap. The dog's not there for decoration, the dog's there for vermin. So that's where that is. And it's distasteful, this line. We should just, we have good stuff. Why do we throw this slop? Why do we devalue it? Why do we demean it by dogs? And this is where Jesus changes his mind. This next piece. But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Which means that there's a collateral benefit for being in a Jewish culture at Jesus' time, and that she can't help it that she's a Syro-Phoenician woman, and being pesky. She has a sick daughter. And if you've been to India and you've watched the sick come at you with children who are ill, they want money, they want blessing, they want something, and it can be absolutely overwhelming. When I was in India, we were traveling on foot, and I had a woman come up with what clearly looked to me like a dead baby. I was not prepared for that encounter at all. I tried to calm her down. I had given away all my money for the day, so I didn't have money left to give to her or a child. She was frantic. I was anxious. I wasn't like Jesus at all. I couldn't even come up with a conversation or attempt at some gesture that would have meaning to her. It's horrible. Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And then he changes. For saying that, you may go. I can't deal with this any longer, is how you read that under text. The demon has left your daughter. And this follows Mark and Matthew's other idea that if you pester God long enough, God will have to answer. So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. That's the normal story. Jesus meets people with unclean spirits all the time in the Gospel of Mark in particular. In Mark, the casting out of demons is the sign that the kingdom of God is at hand. First thing he does after he says the kingdom of God is at hand, he's talking to a demon. And Jesus says to the demon, "What do you and I have to do with each other?" In very curt Greek. And Jesus doesn't know, but he casts out the spirit anyway. And it's what magicians did. And we'll see Paul raise the issue of whether people who are not Jews use the name of Jesus for healing and whether that's okay. And it is. So you can see the church agonize post-Jesus about whether it will expand at all. Is it just a Jewish sect? Paul goes off and preaches to the Gentile. They get it, some of them, and that's where the church went. The Jewish church is mostly embedded in the Gospels and in the New Testament, but it is, except for the people on Granby Street who think that Jewish people want to become Christians, and that's just me doing my Jesus thing, Episcopal thing. I don't know what they're doing, but they're following actually the British Prime Minister who wanted to retake Israel so that Christ would come back. That was the point. That was why he set out to do it. And of course, it's just craziness. For saying that, and Matthew is very important to see that that Mark and then Matthew want to constrict that because they don't know which way the church is going. In 65 in Mark, they haven't, 60, maybe 65, they have no idea which way the church is going, and maybe it will just be a small Jewish sect meeting on Saturday night and having another meet in the synagogue and then going to church on Sunday morning when Jesus was resurrected, and they're hiding, and then come persecutions, and then you get Matthew, and then come actually Luke, who is really interested in expanding the gospel to all Gentiles everywhere because he's a Gentile Christian. And then you have John, who summarized it all by making it all spiritual. That's the flow of the Gospels. It's a brilliant book in that respect. The problem is particulars. It's always in the particulars. How do we know if God is at work in us and with us and among us? How do we know that that's true for people who don't fit into our model of the people that God should work with? Well, if we were Eastern Orthodox, we'd already have the answer because they haven't left the 4th century. They keep saying grace. It's about grace. Grace is everywhere. Everybody's in it. Get over it. We say with Augustine, well, we've all sinned and maybe not. Maybe God doesn't like sin and maybe God will turn away. And then you get the Protestant variation of that. We once were lost and now unfound, and now that you're found, you can just go to sleep. That's rude. But you can see it in the culture. You can see why only 50 people or less are coming to our churches. That's what they're getting. They've heard the gospel, they've repented, they've been baptized, and what do they hear in church? You bad people. And mostly it's bad people out there. But a lot of heavy diet of that would make you question whether you could ever be loved in your life. And that is where we come in as Anglicans, and we say, well, we don't know what God is doing, but we're looking. We're wanting to find it out, and probably it's happening somewhere where we're not. So we'll keep looking as best as we can in all directions. And maybe find a Syrophoenician woman. And maybe they'll convert us, which is the way this text goes in the Old Testament. Abraham is married to Sarah, and kings in Israel want to marry her, and there are 3 different stories about that, where God doesn't come to Abraham and say, get out of there. He comes to the king who wanting to marry his wife, who he's parading around as his sister. 3 of these stories in the Old Testament. And the rulers, or the non-believing people, are the people who get it and come and say, well, Abraham, you know, I just, isn't that your wife? And Abraham has to confess in all 3 stories. So it's a very important problem. What happens when you are in faith and where you're in faith? I'm a cradle Episcopalian, and 50% of you aren't. But that doesn't make me better than you. It just means I have to ask more questions. Where we find God is always astonishing. It comes in at us from unexpected directions. That's what this text is about. And we can throw the food to the dogs because sometimes they understand what they're eating and we don't. Seriously. Some of the holiest people I've met are not in our tradition at all. They're not even in the Christian tradition. They live in other places, do other things. You can read spiritual literature that is non-Christian and go, oh, that's a perspective I never knew. What can I do with that? So when the world changes, as it has been changing for us, there really are 2 traditions. The usual tradition in the Episcopal Church, and it's the usual tradition now, is to make your congregation like a fortress. You want your people to come and you want to shelter them. I had this conversation with a priest about 2 months ago. You want to shelter them from the world. And the old Anglican triumvirate of what's bad is the world, the flesh, and the devil. Okay? And you're going to do that once a week on Sunday and maybe a Bible study. You're going to be able to shelter people from the world when they can turn on television and see this week's news. A plane we can't find. Children that have died in a ferry boat accident. All sorts of stories that you know and I know, where we wonder about God, and we should throw a little bread to the dogs because sometimes they get in and we don't. We should listen to the dogs. We look at dogs, they're really models of fidelity, and they're models of instinctive life, and so we should feed the dogs. We should always feed them. Cats are, of course, a different story, and I'm not qualified to talk about them. But they have their own grace. So like the spiritual life being an encounter with oneself in the service of the world, also encountering the world is in the service of ourselves. And so we walk around, I do, drooling most of the time because it's not clear. The paradigms that I have do not meet the exigency of what I'm facing. They don't. So I have to make new ones, and I'm still struggling. But what we're called to do is to realize we should be Orthodox. You know, our Eucharist is modeled on their theology, that grace is everywhere, and therefore we are not privileged to have it. We are privileged to have it, but we're not privileged as people. That is, privileges in our nook to have it, because it is universal. And I can't understand a lot of theology that doesn't begin with that notion of grace. And that's what Jesus is learning and exhibiting in this passage, is that grace is operating even when the religious forms are not followed. And it's happening everywhere. And you can find it. If you listen to Kate Blanchett open that wonderful set of trilogy of Lord of the Rings, you hear the rootedness that she has in her voice. That's training, and I had some of that training, but I can't do that. She's worked at it. She's learned grace through her work. She's learned grace through being more and more what she was made for, and that's our job. And we get surprised because people don't follow our schemata of how life ought to be. Life is complicated, and therefore God is complicated, and therefore we're complicated, and how we ever get out of bed in the morning, sometimes I don't know. But it's in those encounters that we change. This is one of the places in Mark where Jesus is going to we don't know what he does in Mark, we have to go to Matthew he's going to decide to die. And he's going to really figure out that if he doesn't die, his ministry has been for nothing. So the point of our liturgical year is what we've just been through in Easter. And we've skipped because for some reason the Anglican Church doesn't want us to talk about the crucifixion in the middle of Lent, but of course the lectionary needs to be changed. It's our finitude that makes us grow, like we see here. It's our finitude. It isn't our grace and excitement, although that's helpful, right? What happens is you walk into a room with people that you don't know, and you sit down and you know them worse. You know, they're really not like you. And my first reaction, I don't know what yours is, this is going to be a tough night. It's going to be a tough sell. I don't even know how to be charming. I don't even know what to say. I don't have any references that I know of. And so we talk about sports. It's impoverished. So the demons have us because we're empty. And we're empty in one way because we believe that what we know is all we have to know. And I'm not criticizing you, I'm criticizing myself. I work at this all the time and I still don't know enough to be a human being. And I always want the children to be fed first because the children are going to like me. Maybe not after this lecture, but we're just going to do the best we can. It's easier to work among the people that you know, even if you don't know them well. It's harder to sit down at table, as we're commanded to do in both the Old and the New Testament, and break bread with people we don't know and people we don't like, and make what the book of, it's one of those books, Ephesians, says is a table between us and the world. Or as the psalmist says, I prepare a table in the face of your enemies. And we don't do that. We don't do that as a nation. We don't do that in our political life. We don't do that in our religious life enough. And we need to go, oh, okay, this is bad. I guess I got to learn something. I don't know. It's hard. I'm 60 and I have the desire of most people my age is really, can I go to sleep now? I worked really hard. And can I just take it easy? And the answer is yes, because I need to, and no, because life isn't done with me yet, and Jesus isn't done with me yet, and God certainly isn't done with me yet. So, still working on all of that stuff. It's openness that is so hard, because cultural identity, personal identity, and the whole schema of how culture operates puts us in a grid where some things we can't perceive just because we live where we live. We just can't see it. So when you realize that you're comfortable, and I hope all of you are reasonably comfortable, adventure. just adventure out. My way of that is walking into strange restaurants and trying to figure out, now, where are these people from and what am I doing here and how am I going to make my way? Used to be very clear, the way of Christians used to be very clear. Episcopal Church still says you come to church, you get baptized, that's mostly it, but then you get confirmed because you're an adult now and you can say that you believe things that you maybe haven't thought ever about, but that was true in my confirmation class. The last confirmation class I taught for kids, it was wonderful. I handed them Rite 1, and I said, do you have any questions of any of the words in here? It's full of words, heavy. You could fill the words in the Rite 1, and I love Rite 1. I love celebrating it. I love it. But you can put those big words in a wheelbarrow and not be able to carry it. And they said, one of the kids chimed up, and I'll never forget it. He said, what does the word doth mean? And I went to the rector of the parish, which wasn't this rector, and I said, this rite is not understanded of the people, at least not these people. And that didn't change anything, but and I didn't expect that it would. But what's important is that if we're trying to praise God in Elizabethan language, which I dearly love, all of that, and understand it, it does something in my heart that Rite 2 doesn't. Rite 2 does a lot in my heart that Rite 1 doesn't. Love all of that. But our kids, what is doth? Much less the big theological clunkers in that thing, which really are based on pre-Reformation, post-Reformation ideas that really, we don't talk like this except in church. And I think when we do, it goes for many people. So, since I was trained to do all of that, what we have here are the demons. Demons come in, and this is psychologically true, when we're empty. They fill space. They take root in us, and I don't call them demons. I wouldn't be able to practice my Jungian trade with that, but possession was what Jung talked about as the main problem. And we get possessed by that, bored with ourselves, bored with the world. We lose our energy, and so we have to address that. So what Jesus is deciding is that really it's okay that we have a Gentile ministry, even though at this point in history, as Mark has written down, We don't know what to do with it yet. And then Paul, who's writing, if this is 60, Paul wrote first in like 49. And so that gap between Jesus, Paul, and the Bible is enormous in terms of time because things are changing at such a fast rate. So we get perspectives actually from all over the place. I was doing a teaching on Satan and found Satan live and well in terms of hermeneutics in a passage in Isaiah. And of course, the passage in Isaiah wasn't about Satan, but the church picked it up as a proof text that there was one. And so he's coming to get you tonight. And so let us go to church and we'll get some food. It'll get thrown at us. We'll eat it. We'll see what it does to us. That's my stance. I know it's grace, even if I don't get it. And then we move on out into a world that is very needy and very foreign to the concepts of anything transcendent at this point in culture at all. So we need the church. We need it badly. And we need to know that we need to build those bridges out into the world the way, let's say, television does. And it's annoying, but they have more people come to church for a couple of hours. They're at television. I think the average is now in the 30s somewhere, hours a week. We don't have any evangelism that can cut through that, except to note it, confront it like this, and move on. We are the children of God, and we're fortunate that we get to eat the food that God provides us here. But what we need to know is that we are not the people who need it most. A lot of people need to hear it, not from the theological standpoint, because I said those big words really crush people in this country because, of course, the educational system is in tatters. But you can go talk about what life looks like, what Jesus is learning, to talk to this woman from her own perspective and grant her a wish that is out of need, deep need, and to heal the daughter the way we need to be healed. Thank you.